morning and welcome back to Ingaland. This is Frank and Kaylin, and today we're going to talk about the Indian history at Ingaland. We're down in the cabin where we have the Indian artifacts that I was able to get from Inga in this display, and the pipe that's in there is not the pipe that came from the farm, but it's a close as I could get as a reproduction to the one that Inga had. Um, all the artifacts came from the farm, and the pipe came from down in what we call Indian Point. And Inga said that her and her sister Sarah were walking behind their dad, pulling the one bottom plow in 1918, and the pipe just popped up out of the ground. And the pipe was gray clay. It wasn't red catlinite like this one, but it was that same shape. And it had two arrows carved on the bowl facing on each side, facing opposite directions. And for years, when I would go visiting, I would always ask her to bring out the Indian artifacts and let me look at them, knowing that she would know that I, had some interest in them and that I was trying to keep the history of the farm intact. And so I always wanted to express the fact that I wanted to keep the Indian artifacts. And she had them in a box. And so every time I would ask her, she'd bring them out. And one of the last times that I went to visit her, I asked her if I could look at the Indian artifacts. And she brought the box out and opened it up, and the pipe wasn't in there. And I said, "Well, Inga, where's the pipe?" And she said that uh, some distant relatives from California had stopped by and had given her $5 for it and took it with them. And of course, I felt horrible and kind of panicked, and so I asked her if I could get their address, and so she gave me their address in California. And for a year, once a month, I wrote letters asking if there was any way that I could get it returned back to the farm, just to keep it with the other artifacts. And not that I was a artifact collector or anything. I just wanted to keep the history of the farm together, and thinking that it would probably lose its significance in California. It'd be nice if it was still here. Anyway, after about a year, they finally responded and said that it was their only connection to the Hanson land, and that they didn't want to sell it for any price and they were going to keep it. So at that point, I decided the best thing I could do is make a reproduction of it. So that's what the pipe is. The other pieces are fleshing stones and arrowheads that all came from the farm here. And there was also a box of implements that was hammer heads that were beautifully carved with the ring around, and some other implements. It was a whole box of those that got sold when Inga had her auction. And I had almost no money at the time because I had scraped everything I could to get together to make the down payment on the farm when I got it. Anyway, the one thing that I thought would be nice to keep together were all the Indian artifacts, because that would show the history before Inga's family came. Anyway, right before the artifacts came up on the auction, there was a box of those too, a fairly large box. Anyway, I got stung by a bee, and my parents live about 4 miles from here, and my mother was also anaphylactic and had a bee sting kit. So I had to run home to my parents and have my mother give me this bee sting shot as I was having this allergic reaction. And for about an hour, I laid on the couch and I felt horrible, but I kept thinking I got to get back to try to get the Indian artifacts. Anyway, by the time I got back, they had already been sold for $118. And a guy that has a cabin on the other side of the lake actually got them. And I asked him if there was any, I told him had bought the farm and I wanted to keep the Indian artifacts together. And I said, I'll, give you a profit. What if you be willing to sell them back? And he said, no, I don't want to sell them. So I didn't get those either. But so I did get these. And my thinking is most of the artifacts that have been found here are from when the Sioux were here. And the Sioux Indians were here up until the early 1800s. And they signed a treaty in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin in 1825 that relinquished the rights to the Sioux territory here. And then they were moved further south to like Sisseton and down in there. Anyway, after that, the Chippewa that came from the north then came down, and the Chippewa tribe that came to this area that lived were called the Muckmadua Winniwug. Excuse me, Muckmadua Winniwug, which meant men of many lakes, and Winniwug meant men of, and Muckmadua meant many lakes. And the Chippewa that lived by Lake Superior were called Gitchigumi Winniwug, which meant men of big waters. So here they were men of many waters. And Inga said until 1910, an Indian family would come every summer and stay on Kings Island, which is maybe a half a mile north of here on the lake. And she said that when they would butcher animals, those that the people, the Indian people that were camping there for the summer, would come down and ask for the hooves from the butchering process. And I never did find out what they were doing with the hooves, but Inga always told the story that they would come down and ask for the hooves. So more artifacts have been found here on this property than any of the other surrounding areas. And there's some property that's just south of here about a mile where there's some fairly large burial grounds. But the family that owns that farm where the burial grounds are claim that they've never really found any artifacts. And it might be just that they haven't looked for them. But so we're fortunate enough to have these that still remain that show that there was a fairly large concentration of Native Americans that lived here for a long time before any Europeans came. So that's about what I can think of, what I know about the Indian history so far, and continue to try to find out more and research as we go along, because I think that history is just as important as Inga's history here and my history. So there we are. We're in the cabin, and these are the Indian artifacts, and that's what little we know about the Native Americans that lived here. And they apparently, the Cormorant Lakes were covered in wild rice at the time, and they harvested wild rice. And I'm sure where we found most of the artifacts down on what we call Indian Point, they probably harvested wild rice there, and probably gave thanks to the four gods with that Indian pipe many times. But so that's it for the Indian history, and we'll see you the next time from Ingaland.